"I want to stay and have your baby," she said, and Rancher broke tradition. The cold wind swept across the vast Montana plains, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and the faint tang of cattle. The land seemed endless, a sea of golden brown stretching to the horizon, broken only by the silhouette of mountains far away. This was Ethan Calloway's world, a place where tradition ruled every corner of life. For generations, the Calloways had managed their ranch with discipline and patience, raising cattle and tending the land in ways passed down from father to son. Ethan had grown up with these rules, and they shaped him into a man of quiet strength. He was tall and sturdy, with hands roughened by years of labor, eyes that could read the clouds and the ground, and a heart that rarely let anyone inside. Ethan's life was simple, almost austere. Each day began at dawn when the first light touched the barns and ended late at night when the animals were safely inside and the stars blanketed the sky. The ranch demanded everything from him: attention, sweat, and sometimes sacrifice. There had been little room for visitors, no interest in distractions, and certainly no place for complications. That's how Ethan liked it: controlled, predictable, unchanging. But that winter, something, or someone, was about to challenge everything he had built. The snow had come early that year, blanketing the plains in a soft white layer. The cold was sharp, but it was also beautiful, making the mountains gleam like crystal in the morning sun. It was during this first snowfall that Lila Harper arrived at the Calloway Ranch. She was unlike anyone Ethan had ever met. She came from the city, far from the wide open spaces of Montana, and her life had been full of noise, hurried streets, and endless people. But something had driven her to leave all that behind. Maybe it was a sense of being trapped. Maybe it was hope for a fresh start. Whatever it was, she stepped onto the ranch with nothing but a suitcase and a quiet determination in her eyes. The first time Ethan saw her, he was leaning against the barn door, watching the snow fall like tiny diamonds. Lila stood there awkwardly, shivering in her thin coat, looking lost but not defeated. She introduced herself politely, her voice soft but steady. She needed work, she said, and she hoped the ranch could give her a chance. Ethan, true to his usual caution, hesitated. Outsiders were rare here, and a stranger meant unpredictability. But there was something in Lila's gaze, something earnest and unassuming, that made him nod. She could stay, for now. The first days were not easy. Lila struggled with the physical demands of the ranch, carrying hay, feeding the cattle, mending fences in the biting cold. It was nothing like her life in the city. Ethan watched her carefully, ready to step in if she faltered. But she never complained. She worked hard, learned quickly, and even laughed at her own mistakes. It was a sound that seemed almost foreign to the quiet ranch, yet strangely comforting. For Ethan, it was the first crack in the wall he had built around himself. Lila also had a way with the animals. Cows that were usually stubborn and skittish seemed to respond to her gentle voice. Horses that had been wary of strangers allowed her near. Even the farm dogs, loyal and wary of newcomers, followed her willingly. Ethan noticed these small miracles. It wasn't just skill, it was care, patience, and a natural instinct that made her seem alive in a way the ranch hadn't seen in years. Over the weeks, their days fell into a rhythm. Mornings were cold and laborious, afternoons filled with chores and training, evenings spent inside the warmth of the old cabin by the fire. Ethan was quiet, as always, but he noticed how Lila moved through the ranch with grace and energy, turning even the hardest tasks into something lighter. They didn't speak much at first. Silence was easier, safer. But slowly, as they worked side by side, conversations began to blossom. small ones at first, about the weather, the cattle, the upcoming tasks. Then more personal ones about dreams, fears, and memories. Ethan was careful to keep his distance, but Lila had a way of seeing beyond the armor he wore. One evening, after a long day of mending fences, they sat outside the barn. The sky a deep indigo, stars sparkling like fireflies. Lila broke the silence first. She told Ethan about the city she had left behind, how it had felt suffocating, how she longed for space, quiet, and freedom. She spoke about family she had lost touch with, and a life that had been filled with struggles she never fully shared. Ethan listened, silent, absorbing each word. It was rare for him to hear someone speak so openly, and rarer still to feel a connection forming through mere words. As days turned into weeks, a subtle bond formed between them. Ethan found himself looking forward to Lila's presence, to her laughter, to the way she approached each task with determination and care. Lila, in turn, noticed the small acts of kindness Ethan rarely showed. A hand extended to steady her on icy steps, a warm drink left by the fire, a protective presence that never demanded recognition. She respected his boundaries, but she also saw the man behind the rancher, a man capable of deep loyalty, quiet humor, and strong principles. One particularly harsh morning, a blizzard swept across the plains. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the animals became restless. Ethan worked tirelessly, moving between barns and pastures to ensure every cow was safe, every horse accounted for. Lila followed without complaint, her small hands gripping tools, her resolve unwavering. At one point, Ethan slipped on the icy ground. Without thinking, Leela caught him, her eyes wide with concern. For the first time, Ethan felt a strange warmth in his chest, not from the fire, not from the hard work, but from the simple human connection standing before him. He didn't say anything. He rarely did. But he remembered the moment as he would remember every small gesture of care in the days to come. That night, after the storm passed, they sat in the cabin, exhausted but safe. The fire crackled, casting soft shadows on the wooden walls. Lila sipped her tea, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Ethan watched her quietly, wondering how someone so different from him could feel so essential to the ranch, to the rhythm of his life. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer empty, but filled with a sense of understanding. Winter pressed on, harsh and unrelenting, but it also brought them closer. They shared simple meals, swapped stories of past mistakes and triumphs, and found humor in the most ordinary things: a spilled bucket of water, a stubborn cow, a broken fence. The ranch, once a place of routine and solitude, began to feel warmer, fuller, almost alive in a new way. Ethan still maintained his distance, still kept his feelings hidden, but he couldn't deny the change Lila had brought. There was a spark, subtle yet undeniable, that made him question the life he had always believed was complete. By the time the first hints of spring appeared, small patches of green grass pushing through the snow, the soft chirping of birds returning, Ethan realized that the season had not only transformed the land, but had begun to transform him as well. Lila had become more than a worker, more than a companion in chores. She had become a presence he could not ignore, a force that made him reconsider the rules and walls he had always lived by. And yet, neither of them spoke of what that meant. They continued to work, to laugh, to share quiet moments, each aware that something unspoken was growing between them. The ranch remained demanding, the days long, but now there was a warmth in the air that had nothing to do with the fire. It was in the way they moved through the work together, the way their eyes met in understanding, and the way their laughter echoed across the plains like a promise of something more. Ethan had never allowed himself to hope for this kind of connection. He had believed that life was simple: work hard, respect tradition, and let nothing disturb the order. Lila, with her gentle persistence and fearless heart, was quietly challenging everything he thought he knew. And for the first time in his life, Ethan felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar but powerful. The possibility that life could be richer, fuller, and brighter than he had ever imagined. The Montana plains stretched endlessly around them, cold and unforgiving, yet filled with beauty and life. Within this vastness, two people from very different worlds were beginning to carve a new path, one built not only on survival and tradition but also on trust, understanding, and the quiet beginnings of a bond that neither had expected, but both would soon realize they could not live without. Winter had begun to loosen its grip on the Montana plains, and the first signs of spring crept slowly through the snow-covered fields. Patches of green grass peeked through where the frost had begun to melt, and the sun, brighter and warmer, lingered longer in the sky each day. For most of the ranch, this was a season of hope and preparation. Crops needed tending, fences needed repair, and the livestock required constant care. But for Ethan Calloway, it had become something more complicated. He noticed Lila more each day in ways he didn't quite understand. It wasn't just the way she moved through the barn or the way she handled the animals with gentle confidence. It was in her small gestures, the way she smiled when a calf found its footing, the way she laughed softly when she stumbled over a frozen puddle, the way she seemed to carry warmth even when the wind cut sharply across the plains. Ethan, a man of few words and rigid routines, found himself looking forward to her presence. Their work continued in the same rhythm as always, but now it carried a subtle layer of connection. Mornings were spent checking the herds and feeding the cattle. Lila followed Ethan's instructions carefully at first, learning the routines and absorbing the details that kept the ranch running smoothly. She made mistakes, as anyone would, but she always corrected them with patience and grace. Ethan had expected her to falter under pressure, but she didn't. She worked tirelessly, never complaining about the cold or the back-breaking labor. He respected that. One morning, a small incident brought them closer than ever. A cow had wandered off the fence line and gotten caught in a patch of frozen brambles. Ethan was about to go after it alone when Lila stepped forward, insistently. "I can help," she said, her voice steady. At first, Ethan hesitated, used to doing everything himself, but there was a determination in her eyes he could not ignore. Together they freed the cow, hands scratched and bruised, clothes soaked with snow and sap. In the process, they laughed quietly at their clumsy movements, and for the first time Ethan realized how much he enjoyed the sound of her laughter. That day, as they returned to the barn, Ethan felt a shift within himself. He had always lived according to rules and routines, but Lila's presence reminded him that life wasn't meant to be endured alone. There was space for connection, for laughter, for shared struggles. He didn't say this aloud, he never did, but he felt it in the quiet moments, in the way she looked at the horizon with curiosity, in the way she noticed the smallest details of the ranch, in the way she made the cold mornings feel a little warmer. As the weeks passed, their conversations grew deeper. They spoke of their pasts, of the lives they had left behind. Lila talked about the city, about a world that moved too fast, where people rarely stopped to notice anything but their own problems. Ethan listened, intrigued by her perspective. He shared little of his own story. He had been raised to be strong, silent, dependable, but sometimes, under the warmth of a fire or the quiet of a starlit night, he would let small details slip. Lila was fascinated by the ranch, by its rhythm, and by the way Ethan seemed to understand every blade of grass, every animal, every shift in the weather. She asked questions, genuinely curious, and Ethan found himself answering more openly than he had ever done with anyone else. There was a quiet respect between them, a mutual understanding that grew with each passing day. One afternoon, as the snow melted and the air smelled of fresh grass, Lila accompanied Ethan to check the fences on the far side of the property. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of thawing earth, and the world seemed peaceful for the first time in months. They walked side by side, each absorbed in the work but also aware of the other's presence. "I never thought I'd like this place," Lila admitted, glancing around at the rolling fields and distant mountains. "I thought I'd feel trapped, like in the city. But it's different here. It feels alive." Ethan nodded, not saying much, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. It was rare for him to speak about feelings, even rarer to admit anything personal. But her words resonated. He had never considered that someone else could feel at home here, in the quiet expanse he had known all his life. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them strengthened. They shared meals by the fire, talking quietly while the wind howled outside. They worked together without words sometimes, understanding each other through glances, gestures, and the rhythm of labor. It was a silent companionship that felt more profound than either had expected. One evening, after a long day of moving hay bales and mending fences, Ethan found himself watching Lila as she sat by the fire, peeling an apple with precise, delicate movements. Her hair fell in soft waves around her face, and the glow of the fire highlighted the warmth in her eyes. Ethan felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, a protective, almost tender feeling. He quickly looked away, not wanting her to see it. He had never allowed himself to feel this way about anyone. Lila, however, seemed to notice the small ways he softened around her. She didn't push, didn't comment. She simply smiled and continued her work. Her patience was a quiet force, gentle but unyielding, and it began to melt the walls Ethan had built around himself. One particularly challenging day, a sudden snowstorm arrived, turning the plains into a white blur. Visibility dropped quickly, and the animals became anxious. Ethan and Lila worked together tirelessly to guide the cattle to safety and secure the barns. Cold and exhausted, they finally made their way back to the cabin. Hands red and stiff from the cold, clothes soaked through. Lila shivered but refused to complain, her determination unwavering. Ethan, watching her struggle against the wind, felt a surge of admiration and concern. Inside the warmth of the cabin, they finally allowed themselves a moment of rest. Lila poured tea, and Ethan sat silently, watching the steam rise from the cup. They didn't need words at that moment. The shared struggle had created a connection stronger than any conversation. As the storm cleared, Ethan found himself reflecting on the changes Lila had brought into his life. He had always believed that the ranch and its traditions were enough, that his life was complete in its routine and solitude. But now he realized that he had underestimated the value of companionship, of shared laughter, of someone who cared enough to stand beside him through the storms, literal and figurative. Lila, too, was learning from Ethan. She saw the discipline and dedication required to maintain the ranch, the deep respect for the land and the animals, and the quiet strength it took to face each day with unwavering commitment. She admired his integrity, his resilience, and his ability to endure hardships without complaint. In return, she offered him something rare, a perspective from outside, a reminder that life could also be filled with warmth, curiosity, and gentle joy. Over time, their interactions became more natural, more comfortable. They joked quietly while mending fences, exchanged knowing glances when tasks became repetitive, and found small ways to care for each other without words. Ethan began to anticipate her movements, her needs, and her presence, Lila, in turn, learned to read his moods, understanding when to give space and when to offer comfort. It was a delicate balance, a dance of unspoken understanding that neither had expected but both came to cherish. One spring morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, painting the plains in shades of gold and pink, Ethan and Lila stood side by side surveying the land. The air was crisp, filled with the promise of new life. Calves nuzzled their mothers in the fields, birds returned to their nests, and the world seemed to hum with quiet energy. Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, and as he glanced at Lila, he realized that part of that peace came from her presence, from the bond they had formed through shared labor, trust, and patience. It was in these small, quiet moments that Ethan began to understand the depth of their connection. He had lived a life guided by rules, discipline, and tradition, but now he saw the value of something more, a companionship built on mutual respect, understanding, and care. He didn't fully understand the feelings stirring within him, but he knew they were important, and he knew he didn't want to ignore them. Lila, too, felt the growing significance of their bond. She had arrived at the ranch seeking work and refuge, but she had found something unexpected, a connection with a man who had been cautious, reserved, and distant, yet capable of profound loyalty and quiet affection. The days spent together, filled with work, laughter, and shared struggles, had created a foundation of trust and understanding. And as she watched Ethan tend to the land with dedication and care, she felt a sense of admiration and affection that went beyond simple friendship. By the time spring was fully underway, the ranch had transformed not only with the season, but with the subtle, unspoken bond between Ethan and Lila. Their days were filled with work and challenges, but also with moments of shared understanding, quiet laughter, and a growing sense of partnership. The Montana plains, harsh and beautiful, had become a backdrop for a connection neither had anticipated, but both had come to rely upon. It was a slow, gentle journey, marked by trust, respect, and small moments of joy. Ethan and Lila had learned to navigate the challenges of the ranch together, supporting each other through the cold, the labor, and the unpredictability of life on the plains. And in doing so, they had discovered a bond that was steady, comforting, and quietly transformative, a bond that promised something deeper, waiting patiently to reveal itself when the time was right. The ranch had settled into the rhythms of spring. The snow had melted and green shoots of grass stretched across the plains like a fresh carpet. The animals were more active, calves played in the fields, and the cattle moved with more freedom than they had all winter. The days were warmer, the evenings longer, and the sun painted golden streaks across the horizon. For most people, spring was simply a season of work and renewal. For Ethan Calloway and Lila Harper, it had become something far more complex. Ethan had spent years living by rules, unspoken rules passed down from his father and his father before him. The ranch came first. Discipline came first. Emotion was secondary, sometimes even unwelcome. He had built his life carefully, following routines and expectations, keeping everyone, and perhaps even himself, at a distance. But Lila's presence had changed everything. She was no longer just an employee, no longer just the young woman who had arrived timidly that first winter. She had become a companion, someone whose laughter and care had begun to warm the corners of his life he didn't even know were cold. He noticed her in little ways, how she adjusted a fence post with perfect precision, how she moved gracefully among the animals, the soft hum she made when she worked. He noticed how her eyes lit up when she discovered a newborn calf, or when a horse nuzzled her hand in trust. Each of these moments, small as they were, began to mean more than he wanted to admit. One evening, after a particularly long day of fixing fences and preparing the fields for the spring grazing, Ethan found himself sitting near the cabin's fire, absently checking the ropes and harnesses he had repaired. Lila moved about quietly, tending to the animals inside the barn. He could hear her soft footsteps and the faint clatter of tools, and a feeling he could not name settled in his chest. He realized, as he watched her work, that he had come to rely on her presence, not just for help, but for comfort, for understanding, for something he had never allowed himself to need. Later, when Lila emerged from the barn, brushing straw from her hair, Ethan spoke for the first time that evening. "The fence lines look better than I thought they could," he said quietly. There was no real praise in his tone, that wasn't his way, but she heard it, and it made her smile. "Thanks," she replied softly. "I'm learning from the best." Ethan's gaze softened, just for a moment as he looked at her. "Keep at it," he said simply. There was meaning in those words he didn't voice, a depth she recognized. She understood that he was not a man given to flowery language or unnecessary emotion. But she also understood that, in his way, he was expressing trust, respect, and perhaps something more. The days passed, each filled with work, conversation, and quiet moments of shared understanding. Ethan noticed himself lingering when she was near, finding excuses to walk by her side while checking the cattle, or to offer her a cup of tea when she paused to rest. Lila, in turn, noticed the subtle ways he included her in decisions, the way he valued her opinion about the animals, the land, and even the routines of the ranch. She respected him deeply, not just for his skills or his dedication, but for the strength of character he displayed every day. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, while walking through the fields checking the fences, that Lila's feelings became impossible to hide. She had tried to contain them, to let them remain unspoken, respecting the boundaries that Ethan had always maintained. But the truth had grown too strong, and the fear of regret had grown stronger. The sun was warm on their backs, the grass soft beneath their boots, and the world seemed impossibly beautiful. Lila stopped walking and turned to him, her hands clasped together nervously. "Ethan," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you." He turned to face her, sensing the seriousness in her tone. His expression was unreadable as always, but his eyes softened slightly. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and calm. She took a deep breath, looking him directly in the eyes. I want to stay here with you on the ranch." Her voice faltered for a moment, and then she continued, steadier now. "And I want to have your baby." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Ethan felt a shock ripple through him. For a man who had lived his life according to rules, who had built walls around his heart, who had never allowed himself to imagine such possibilities, the confession was almost overwhelming. He stood in silence, staring at her, the sound of the wind in the grass filling the void between them. Tradition dictated caution. Family expectations dictated control. His own instincts dictated that he pull away, to retreat into the familiar comfort of routine and solitude. Yet, even as the weight of all these rules pressed upon him, there was a voice inside, quiet but insistent, that whispered a different truth. Love, trust, and courage, sometimes life demanded a risk. Lila waited, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes steady, watching him for a sign. Any sign. "I know, it's sudden," she said softly. "I don't want to pressure you. I had to tell you. I can't keep this to myself anymore." Ethan remained silent for a long moment, weighing the words. He remembered the first winter, when she had arrived timid and unsure, and how she had proven herself over the months. He remembered the blizzards, the long days of labor, the quiet nights by the fire, and how in every one of those moments she had been steady, brave, and true. He thought of the animals, the land, and the rhythms of the ranch that had shaped his life, and he thought of her and the possibility of sharing all of it with someone he had come to care for deeply. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "Lila, this isn't easy for me. You know that. My life has always been controlled, predictable. I've followed rules my whole life, rules that never included this." He gestured vaguely between them, unable or unwilling to put words to the depth of feeling that had begun to stir within him. Lila nodded, understanding. She didn't interrupt. She waited, patient, giving him the space he needed to speak. "I've lived this long thinking the ranch and its traditions were enough," Ethan continued. "That my life didn't need complications." He paused, glancing at her, his eyes searching hers. "But you've changed that. I don't know how or why, but you've made me see something different, something I've been blind to." Lila stepped closer, her voice gentle. "You don't have to decide anything now," she said. "I just needed you to know how I feel. That's all." Ethan looked at her, his chest tight with emotions he had long buried. For years he had lived by caution, by isolation, by adherence to rules that had never included love or family, parts of that corset. And now, in this quiet moment on the Montana plains, he realized that he could not ignore the truth anymore. The choice before him was clear, even if it terrified him. He could stay within the safety of tradition, or he could take a risk for something real, something lasting, something human. After a long silence, Ethan spoke again, softer this time. "If we do this, it will change everything. Life here, the ranch, my family, it will never be the same." "I know," Lila replied. Her voice was steady, filled with quiet determination. "And I'm ready. I want to face all of it with you." For the first time in his life, Ethan felt a mixture of fear and hope. The fear of breaking tradition, of challenging expectations, of facing the unknown, pressed heavily on his shoulders. But there was also hope. Hope for companionship, for love, for a family, and for a future that had once seemed impossible. He reached for her hand, and when their fingers intertwined, it was like a promise, a bridge between their hearts and a life they could build together. That night, they sat by the fire, talking quietly about the future. They spoke of the ranch, of family, of what it would mean to share a life together. Ethan admitted the rules and expectations he had always followed, and Lila spoke of her willingness to face the challenges that came with loving him. Together, they began to imagine a life that combined the old with the new, tradition with courage, work with love. In the weeks that followed, their bond deepened. Ethan took deliberate steps to prepare for the life they were choosing together. He repaired old barns, cleared new pastures, and began planning for the future in ways he never had before. Lila, meanwhile, continued her work with the animals, tending the fields and learning everything about the ranch that mattered. Their lives were still filled with the demands of the land, but now there was a shared purpose, a shared vision that gave every task new meaning. Slowly, the other ranch hands and neighbors began to notice the change in Ethan. He was quieter, yes, but there was a new warmth in his presence, a softness in his interactions with Lila, and a sense of purpose that had not existed before. Lila's influence on the ranch was subtle but undeniable. She brought compassion, patience, and attention to detail, helping not only with the work, but with the spirit of the place itself. As spring gave way to summer, the reality of their decision settled around them. They had chosen each other, chosen love over caution, courage over tradition. And while the road ahead would not be easy, Ethan knew that for the first time in his life he was not alone. Together they were building something stronger than rules, stronger than fear, a life rooted in trust, respect, and unwavering care. And deep inside, Ethan knew that the ranch, the land, and even the traditions he had always honored would be stronger for it. Because sometimes breaking tradition wasn't about abandoning the past, it was about creating a future worth living. Summer had fully arrived on the Montana plains, painting the land in vibrant shades of green and gold. The sun lingered longer in the sky, warming the wide-open fields and sparkling off the backs of grazing cattle. For Ethan Calloway, life had begun to feel different, though the ranch's work remained just as demanding. Every day still began at dawn with chores and care for the animals, but now there was a sense of warmth and partnership he had never known before. Lila Harper had fully settled into ranch life. She was no longer the newcomer who had arrived timidly that winter. Her confidence had grown alongside her connection to the land. She understood the cattle, the horses, and even the subtle rhythms of the weather. But more importantly, she had become a partner to Ethan, someone whose presence brought balance and light to his structured, disciplined world. The transformation in their relationship was noticeable not only to them but to everyone around the ranch. Ethan's neighbors and even distant family members had begun to see the change. He was quieter, yes, but there was now a softness in his voice when he spoke to Lila, a gentleness in his eyes when he looked at her. The ranch hands, who had once viewed Ethan as reserved and distant, now noticed the way he included Lila in decisions and sought her opinion. She had become indispensable, not just for the work she did, but for the way she influenced the spirit of the ranch itself. One morning, as the sun rose behind the mountains, Lila and Ethan walked the perimeter of the property together. The dew glistened on the grass, and a soft breeze carried the scent of wildflowers from the nearby hills. Lila stopped to examine a section of fence, noticing a post that had begun to lean. "This one needs fixing before the next storm," she said, pointing. Ethan nodded. "You've got a good eye," he said. "I might have missed that if you hadn't pointed it out." His tone was simple, but there was pride in it. Lila smiled, a quiet warmth in her expression. It was moments like this that cemented the bond between them, a mix of trust, respect, and unspoken affection. The summer days were long and filled with work, but Ethan and Lila began to make room for small joys. They walked along the river that cut through the edge of the ranch, skipping stones and listening to the water rush over rocks. They shared meals under the shade of old trees, laughing at small mishaps and teasing each other in gentle, playful ways. The ranch, once a place of strict routine and quiet solitude, had become a home in the fullest sense of the word. One afternoon, a calf was born in the barn. Lila had been the first to notice its arrival, and she called Ethan over immediately. Together, they ensured the newborn calf was healthy, warm, and nursing properly. Ethan watched as Lila cradled the tiny creature, her hands gentle and sure. In that moment, he realized that this, care, tenderness, and responsibility shared, was the life he wanted. The ranch had always been about survival, about hard work and tradition, but it had never been about love, not until now. As the weeks passed, the bond between Ethan and Lila deepened further. They shared their dreams for the future, quietly imagining a life together that balanced the demands of the ranch with family, companionship, and hope. They spoke about the baby Lila hoped to have, and Ethan, who had once feared change, found himself planning for it. He repaired barns, expanded pastures, and organized the ranch with the thought of a family in mind. Each decision carried the weight of responsibility, but also the promise of a future built together. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting the plains in golden light, Ethan and Lila sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the cattle graze. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass. Lila leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, and he felt a sense of peace he had never known. "I'm glad I came here," she whispered. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then spoke softly. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. There was no need for grand declarations. In the simplicity of the words, the depth of feeling was clear. They sat together, content in the quiet companionship they had built, a partnership strengthened by trust, patience, and shared labor. As summer moved forward, life on the ranch continued its rhythm, now infused with love and purpose. The animals thrived, the fields flourished, and the work, though demanding, was now lighter because they faced it together. Neighbors and family members began to notice the change not only in the ranch's operations but in Ethan himself. He was more open, more patient, and more willing to embrace moments of joy rather than just duty. Lila had become a catalyst for growth, both in the ranch and in his heart. Then, one quiet evening, under a sky filled with stars, Lila and Ethan spoke of the future more concretely. They imagined a home filled with laughter, the pitter-patter of little feet across the wooden floors, and the warmth of family traditions passed down with love rather than strict rule. Ethan admitted, with vulnerability rare for him, that he had once believed he could never feel this way about anyone. Lila's response was simple and loving. "We'll face it together." Ethan, who had once been cautious and reserved, embraced the changes with a quiet joy. He prepared the ranch for a child, adjusting routines, reinforcing barns, and ensuring that the land and animals would be cared for in their new life. Lila's energy and dedication never waned. She tended to the animals, helped with the chores, and carried herself with grace even as her body changed. Together, they navigated this new chapter with patience, teamwork, and laughter. The community, initially skeptical of their unconventional path, began to offer quiet support. Neighbors came to help with heavy tasks, offering advice and guidance. Friends brought meals and distant family members visited, observing the love and care that now filled the ranch. Ethan, once wary of outside influence, welcomed the support without reservation. The ranch had become not only a home, but a symbol of what was possible when love and dedication were allowed to shape life. One crisp morning, when the first buds of spring appeared once more, Lila went into labor. Ethan remained calm, though his hands trembled slightly as he prepared the cabin and the barn for the arrival. Neighbors who had been close offered assistance, and together they created a safe, warm space for the child. Lila, though exhausted, was steady and strong, supported by Ethan's presence and quiet encouragement. The hours passed slowly, filled with anticipation and care, until finally the sound of a newborn's cry filled the cabin. Ethan held the tiny, delicate child in his arms, overwhelmed by emotion. Lila, exhausted but radiant, smiled at him. "We did it," she whispered. Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of completeness he had never known. The ranch, the plains, and the life they had built together now held a new meaning. This was not just a home or a livelihood. It was a family, a partnership, rooted in trust, courage, and love. The months that followed were filled with wonder and learning. Ethan adjusted to fatherhood, discovering a tenderness within himself that had been hidden under years of discipline and routine. Lila thrived in her new role, balancing care for the baby with her ongoing work on the ranch. Together, they faced challenges from unpredictable weather to animal care, and they celebrated triumphs, from a thriving crop to the baby's first steps. Each day, the ranch felt more alive, more complete, more meaningful. Neighbors and family members continued to marvel at the transformation. Ethan, once the stoic, solitary rancher, had become a man of warmth, patience, and love. Lila, who had arrived seeking refuge, had become the heart of the ranch, guiding, nurturing, and inspiring. Their life together was not without challenges, but every obstacle was met with cooperation, understanding, and shared purpose. As the years passed, the ranch flourished under their combined care. Children played in the fields, calves grew strong, and the land produced abundant crops. The community respected the family not only for their hard work but for the strength of character, partnership, and love they displayed. Ethan and Lila had created a legacy not only of ranching skill but of courage, compassion, and the willingness to embrace change. One evening, as the sun set over the Montana plains, Ethan and Lila stood together on the porch, watching their children play in the fields, the cattle grazing peacefully nearby. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the wind carried the scent of wildflowers. Lila rested her head against Ethan's shoulder, and he held her close. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Ethan nodded, his eyes reflecting the glow of the sunset. "And we've built something worth everything," he replied. There was no need for more words. The love, the trust, and the partnership they shared were evident in every glance, every touch, and every shared smile. The ranch continued to thrive, not just as a place of work, but as a home filled with laughter, love, and the promise of the future. The Montana plains stretched endlessly around them, harsh and beautiful, but now softened by the warmth of family. Ethan had broken tradition, yes, but in doing so, he had discovered a deeper truth, that life was richest when shared, when love was allowed to guide decisions, and when courage overcame fear. Through seasons of work and seasons of joy, the story of Ethan and Lila became a quiet legend among neighbors, a tale of patience, perseverance, and love that flourished even in the most unexpected places. They had chosen each other, chosen family, chosen hope over fear, and in doing so, they had created a life that was strong, enduring, and deeply human. The ranch, once a place of routine and solitude, had become a living testament to the power of connection, trust, and courage. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the land in gold, Ethan and Lila knew that they had found something rare, something worth everything, a life built together, rooted in love, nurtured by care, and sustained by the unbreakable bond of family.